Estonia should not be successful. For one, it doesn't necessarily hold the best geographical location. Moreover, it has less than 1.4 million people, and about 3 decades ago it was part of a falling empire. It also doesn't have a lot of natural resources, yet it somehow outcompetes even big and rich European countries like Netherlands or Germany when it comes to tech sector and digitalization. The country successfully navigated through countless financial challenges, including the 2000 economic crisis.
Began the steep decline, and in the following 40 minutes of trading, shares in the country's biggest banks were sold down and down,
and emerged as one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. While other big European countries are spending hundreds of billions of dollars trying to join the digital era, Estonia is already winning the race. So how can a small country go from being a failed economy to now having the most unicorn startups per capita, and essentially becoming one of the richest post-Soviet economies? Well, this is the miracle of Estonia. But there are also certain risks that are threatening the country. To really understand the topic, we have to divide the video in few chapters. Estonia's past. Estonia's transition to capitalism. 3 challenges that Estonia has to beat. Before we talk about modern Estonia, we have to realize the past of the country. The country had few decades of independence between 2 world wars. However, Red Army moved in Estonia in 1940 and the country lost independence. Unfortunately, Estonia had to endure one of the harshest realities of the Soviet Union. Thousands of people were arrested, with many of them being executed. Soviet Union wanted complete control over Estonia, including their culture and demographics. Tens of thousands of Estonian men were deported to Russia to fight German invasion. However, almost half of them died due to hunger, cold and overworking. After that, Estonia's territory was occupied by Nazi Germany for few years, before eventually getting reclaimed by the Soviet Union. During the Soviet occupation, Estonia was treated harshly. Tens of thousands of citizens were deported, and to replace the lost population, lots of Russians immigrated in Estonia. This caused huge demographic shifts that still remains to this day. Soviet Estonia wasn't necessarily underdeveloped. For one, the Republic had access to lots of oil shale, which made the USSR focus on developing huge oil shale mining plants in Estonia. This resource was used to power St. Petersburg and local areas. Moreover, Estonia was sometimes used as a testing area for Soviet economy. A lot of reforms and experimental technologies were first implemented in Estonia just to gauge whether or not it was worth it to implement mass-scale adaptation of such technologies. However, even if Soviet Estonia was one of the richest republics, it still lagged a lot compared to Western capitalistic countries. For example, before the occupation, Estonia was almost as rich as Finland. However, 5 decades of following inefficient economic model turned Estonia into a backwater country. In 1993, Estonia's GDP per capita was 8 times less than that of Finland. Needless to say, there is still a huge gap between those 2 countries due to harsh reality of Soviet occupation. Estonia gained independence in 1991. However, they now had to face very challenging environment. Their old systems were gone, and with that they had to completely rewrite their economic structure. How does a small poor country go from having failed economy to then becoming one of the richest and advanced economies in the world? Well, that question brings us to chapter 2. Transitioning to capitalistic model wasn't easy for Estonia. The country had to deal with harsh reality. The old system was gone and their economy was completely collapsed. Economy of Soviet republics was built on shared interests and closed system. For example, certain regions specialized in tea production for the Soviet Union, while other regions were sole suppliers of automobiles to the rest of the country. So, the whole Soviet system was built ground up to serve the country in its own way. Cars produced in Russia were lower quality compared to Western cars. However, the factory had no problem selling them, because, well, Soviet citizens could not just import cars from the United States or Germany. However, that wasn't the case anymore. Estonia had to essentially start from the blank state. There was one thing Estonia had over other post-Soviet countries. A lot of other post-Soviet countries had a lot of problems after gaining independence. For example, Moldova and Georgia both had intense struggles with separatist regions, while Ukraine and Russia were suffering from intense corruption and collapse of their heavy industries. While almost all of the post-Soviet countries were trying to return to their heavy industries, Estonia knew that it just could not compete with industrial giants like Germany or France. The country did not necessarily have a lot of natural resources. Moreover, the population was simply too small for most heavy industries, and heavy industry sectors was soon going to be very competitive. Thus, Estonia decided to take a completely radical approach. They let inefficient state-owned industries die. Compared to that, Belarus and Ukraine were both trying hard, spending millions of dollars on companies that were pretty much dead. However, Estonia passed Bankruptcy Act in 1992, and it basically forced companies to be either profitable or be liquidated. One of the big changes was the introduction of the krone. In 1992, Estonia became the first post-Soviet country to abandon the Russian ruble. The krone was pegged to German mark. This meant two things. Estonia's government was forced to play smart when it came to fiscal policy. They could not just print more money to solve the issues. It was painful, but it killed the 1000 inflation almost overnight. In 1992, Estonians elected 32-year-old historian called Mart Laar. He even admitted that he only had read one book on economics, which was Milton Friedman's book called Free to Choose. And really, Mart Laar's reforms can really be summed up in Free to Choose. He chose to hard reset Estonia's economy. Estonia was one of the first countries to introduce flat tax rates. While flat tax rates are not really popular in most of the countries, it had great effect on Estonia's economy. More and more people were willing to officially declare their earnings and avoid the shadow economy. Mart Laar's another big step was abolishing all import tariffs. This way, Estonian companies were forced to compete with Western companies. One thing was clear: if your company wasn't efficient and modern enough, it had to go. On one hand, a lot of people lost jobs. However, industries that were competitive had much more resources left over. The remaining Estonian companies went from being just competitive enough to survive to now becoming hyper-competitive giants. However, all of this still can't explain why Estonia is a digital hub of Europe. So how did Estonia become the startup heaven? Well, that can be explained in a big decision that took place in 1996. Estonia realized few things. It could not compete with industrial giants. The country had little to no industrial development when it came to heavy industries. So Estonia took a radically different step. The country placed a huge bet on computer technologies. Now, we have to remember that in 1996 internet wasn't as popular as we would like to imagine. A lot of countries had little to no access, and there were little to no companies that were using internet. However, the government launched a program called Tigri, which translates to Tiger Leap. The program was all about digitalization of Estonia. The main idea was to teach people about computers and internet. In a few short years, almost 100% of schools had access to computers and internet. Moreover, a lot of people could now take some of the government-sponsored training for this new technology. Soon after that, a lot of governmental services were digitalized. You could essentially request and upload documents from government without having to leave your house. The bureaucratic friction was almost fully gone. With this simple yet big program, the country was ready to take full advantage of dot-com boom, and that's exactly what happened. Estonia went on to create numerous startups, including Skype, which was acquired by eBay for staggering $2.6 billion. It also went on to create Bolt, which is basically Europe's version of Uber, and is worth billions of dollars. However, despite these successes, Estonia still has to face a lot of challenges that could define its future, which brings us to chapter 3. While Estonia is one of the richest post-Soviet Union countries, it still has to deal with lots of challenges that could significantly affect the country. First of all, we have to address the elephant in the room, which is Russia. I have mentioned that Estonia doesn't have the best geographical location. However, a big part of why I think so is its neighbor. Estonia and Russia doesn't necessarily have the best relationship with each other. Even though Estonia is part of NATO, the country is still skeptical about their safety. This is why Estonia is projected to spend more than 5% of its GDP in defense. To compare that, a lot of NATO members are hesitant to even spend 2% of their GDP in defense. Baltic countries are one of the biggest spenders in terms of military budget, and while sure it can have its own economic benefits, every euro spent towards defense is one less euro towards improving roads or implementing new industries. Another big issue is the labor gap. Estonia has one of the lowest birth rates per woman when it comes to the world. Moreover, the country's median age keeps rising. While there are more than 1,000 startups in Estonia, there is a significant labor gap when it comes to such works. Last but not least is the issue with Estonia's energy. In 2025, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania officially disconnected from Russian-controlled Brel power grid and joined the European grid. While this is great for the nation's security, it provides one big issue. It is believed that in 2024, Estlink 2 was sabotaged, which took a few months to fix. This was a big issue for Estonia, considering that it sometimes depends on imports when it comes to electricity. But Estonia still has a huge issue with the way it generates the energy. Earlier in this video I have mentioned that Estonia is rich in shale oil. In 2025-2026, shale oil accounted for around 15% of Estonia's energy generation. Replacing this amount with renewable energy can be challenging and expensive, but Estonia will still have to replace it due to strict European Union emission standards. From 2021 to 2024, electricity prices in Estonia had almost doubled, which is one of the big problems towards cost of living. Hey, thank you for watching my video. If you have liked the video, please subscribe so you will not miss out on our future uploads.